All right, so today I'm going to talk about the grass-fed dairy production project, which has been running since 2016 now. And so this is just like a little small portion of what I do. I do grazing consulting, I do business planning consulting, but it's been a real privilege since for about 10 years now to be working with Heather Darby and Sarah Ziegler and other folks at the University of Vermont on this grass-fed dairy project. And so there's a lot of different pieces of the project. How many people came to the workshop that I did yesterday on the project? Okay. So for those of you, spoiler alert, the first half of the slides I'm going to show are the same. So I'm going to show some of the survey data and the cost of production data. And then the second half of my slides are going to be kind of starting to look at how we can help farmers change their management to use this information on their farms to hopefully increase their net income and improve farm profitability. So it'll be some of a repeat. I won't be offended if some of you have to run away because you can't listen to the same thing 2 days in a row. And I need glasses so I can see this computer screen. Oh, I can see it up there. Good. So the project initially for the first couple of years was funded with SARE funds, and we were collaborating with Cornell at that point with Faye Benson. Then Heather and Sarah Ziegler were able to get funds through OREI, and that's what's been funding the project for the last many years. There's a lot of different pieces of the project. What I was presenting yesterday on calf raising, on parasitology, the fatty acid composition of the milk, a whole lot of other things. Roy did a session on the sensory evaluation, and there is a table in the corner of the kind of trade show dining room area, and there's copies of a lot of the resource materials available on the project overall. These are all of the people currently participating and contributing to the project. So it's a whole bunch of different places all throughout the whole Northeast region. There's also 50 to 100 dairy farmers that we don't list here too, who are also participating on an advisory board, who are like directing us and telling us what questions should we be asking, what research should we be doing, and then also participating as host farms for the research. You can get a copy of the full grass-fed resource listing on the table in the corner there. You can either there's a few copies of that, or you can just take a picture of it. There's like an online grass-fed dairy production course. There's a whole grass-fed production manual that you can get a copy of. And then I did actually bring with me today some actual paper copies you can take if you're interested in the 2024 grass-fed cost of production benchmark. More resources that I can list. These are just a few snapshots of a few of them. So what I'm going to do, similar to yesterday, I'm just going to kind of set the context by going through some of the data from the 2024 overall survey that was done. The survey mailed out to grass-fed farmers all over the US. And just to set the context of like, what are these grass-fed farms? Then we'll look at the cost of production data, and then we'll shift into talking about some of the management changes that farmers can make. So it was mailed to 509 farms, and we got a 28% response rate on this survey. And farms were mostly in New York, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and then there were also some in Vermont, Wisconsin, Maryland, Virginia, and Minnesota. Small herds, they're 48 cows on average. The age of the farmers, the grass-fed farmers, tends to be younger, 47.6, which may be partly due to the fact that it's a pretty high percentage of farmers in the plain community. 75% of the respondents were from the plain community. They were pretty experienced grazing and organic farmers, 7 years grass-fed on average, and 5 years certified grass-fed. And there were, as usual, it's mostly crossbreds, but there's also a significant portion that are purebred Holsteins and purebred Jerseys. And I want to point out that the percentage of purebred Holsteins was higher than Jerseys, and that if anybody tries to tell you that Holsteins aren't good grazers, they're wrong. There's plenty of Holsteins that do perfectly well on grazing farms and even on these 100% grass-fed farms. The Jerseys do fine too, not being anti-Jersey. So one of the big differences between the grass-fed farms and other types of dairy farms is that once they cut the grain out of the ration, it's a lot more forage to keep them fed, and it needs to be high quality forage. And so they are generally running at a higher acreage per cow. So from this national survey, it was 4.1 acres per mature cow. So that's per lactating and dry cow, total mature herd size. So 4.1 acres per mature cow, but that's not producing all of the feed. They were also 72.3% of them were also buying in 35% of the additional forages needed. And we'll look at, the numbers are a little different with the smaller group in the cost of reduction study. 32% were also taking a little bit more pressure off the land base by doing some custom grazing. So they might have been sending some heifers off the farm. And then in this group, a little over 50% of them were also growing some annual forages, and those would have been for both harvest and storage and for grazing. They were also producing some of their own bedding hay. So there was 10 acres being used for bedding hay. So you can kind of get a sense that that's also building out the amount of acres that they might need. 77% of them were testing the soils, and 81, almost 82% were buying in some fertility. And we'll come back to that later, because that means we've got a certain percentage who are not doing soil tests. And we also have a certain percentage that are bringing in some fertility and maybe not doing some soil tests. 30% did feel like their current forage quality and their forage yields were limiting their milk production and therefore also limiting their income. This national survey also found that the farmers who reported that they were following the soil test recommendations and who were purchasing the soil amendments, those same farmers reported significantly higher milk production than those who weren't doing that. And in addition, farmers who were buying in a variety of soil amendments and not just poultry manure were also reporting a higher annual milk production. So kind of basic agronomy there. They were taking care of their soils. They were making more milk per cow. Their grazing season was on average 195 days. And again, this is a national survey, so it includes some farms that are a little bit further south than the Northeast region here. Just under 80% of them were giving the cows a fresh paddock 2 times a day or more. So these are good grazers. And 50% of them were getting between 80 and 100% of the dry matter intake from pasture during that grazing season. So a high percentage for about half of the farms. Farms that had a higher number of acres per cow that they were managing, or had a higher pasture dry matter intake during the grazing season, reported that they had lower milk production. So we'll come back to that one in a little while. So there's a difference between milk production and milk sales on these farms because they have to feed such a large amount of milk to the calves. So their self-reported milk production before calf milk is diverted was 10,599 pounds. So it's pretty respectable for a grass-fed farm, that number, but compared to a conventional farm, that's pretty low. Yeah, question in the back. On the grass-fed certified farms, are they required to have milk, or can they use any milk replacer at all? Good question. They are required to use milk because there really isn't the organic standards would allow a milk replacer, but there really isn't a commercially available milk replacer. So everybody is feeding whole milk diverted from their cows. Yeah. And they're being paid 50 some odd dollars a hundredweight for that milk. So it's an opportunity cost. Yeah. So before that calf milk is diverted, 10,599, averaging 4.4% fat, 3.4 on protein. And the majority of the farms are milking year round and also milking twice a day, but there's a certain percentage of them who are seasonal where they dry the cows off for a couple of months or might be milking once a day or milking 3 times every 2 days, some of those alternative systems for labor efficiency. Calves on average start going out to pasture on these farms at 3.8 months. And on average with the national survey, we're being fed 1.75 gallons of milk for just over 5 months. And you'll see in the grass-fed survey, they're actually feeding more milk for even longer than that in the cost of production. So that was the high-speed overview of the national survey, the same information as yesterday. And now we'll look at the cost of production data unless there's any questions or any coming in on for you. Okay. Hopefully they asked them yesterday. So the cost of production, oh yeah, Calvin.
This is cost of production on 100% grass-fed?
Yes. Yes, so these farms are 100% grass-fed and they're certified grass-fed. And so the certification standard is for, it's generally, most of these farms are certified to the OPT standard, the Organic Plus Trust, is that right? Yeah, Sarah's nodding. So the organic standards require 30% dry matter intake from pasture for a minimum of 120 days. The grass-fed standard requires 60% from pasture over 150 days. And so the majority of these farms are significantly exceeding that. Though in the drought last year in 2025, we had a number of farms who got very close to that 60% number over that grazing season. So those are kind of the significant differences between the organic standards and grass-fed, other than the fact that grain is completely prohibited for any of the livestock groups, including the young stock. Moore, did you have a question?
Yeah, so when you said that they were seeing like some type of increase forage or yield or whatever the metric was, and you said like not just poultry manure, did it get that specific that you were asking for like the details of what their fertility regimen was? Or?
Yeah, I believe that survey did do that, and we also do that in our cost of production data also. We don't necessarily report that unless it's statistically significant though. Yeah. So the cost of production data is a smaller data set. In 2024, it was 32 farms, and all of the farms in 2024 that participated were in New York and in Vermont. And they have a slightly bigger herd size than the national average at 65 cows, with a range from 28 cows to over 150 cows. And the acreage per mature cow is a little bit larger than the national survey, 5.17 acres per mature cow. Even with that many acres, farms were also estimating that on average, they were buying in 30% of the herd's forage needs. So within that average, there's a range. So we had farms that were under 2 acres per cow, and they were buying in 100% of their forage. And we had farms that were, 6 or 8 or even more acres per mature cow who were making all of their own forages and maybe even selling a little bit of forage in some cases. So there's a wide range within this average that I'm showing you. They were on average selling 8,410 pounds of milk per cow, but the range of milk sold, so this is after the calf milk is diverted, the range of milk sold was from a very low number of just over 4,500 pounds of milk per cow per lactation to over 12,000 pounds of milk per cow per lactation being sold. Let me see. That might. That was the national survey. A couple of slides from now, I have the exact math that I didn't do. Sarah Ziegler did it. That calculates out exactly how much milk these guys were diverting, because we collected the exact. We asked them, how many months did you feed? How many calves? How many gallons a day? So I can tell you the exact number. Yeah. I like that question though. Some good discussion. So one of the other differences between this smaller group in the Northeast region and the national group is that they had been organic for longer. So they'd been 11.7 years organic, 6.6 years grass-fed. Their grazing season was a little bit shorter, but still impressively long for being up near the Canadian border, 185.5 days. And they were on average for all of these farms at 82% intake from pasture during the grazing season, with the difference being then supplemental forages, since obviously there's no grain in the ration. The farms are divided into the average, the lowest cost of production group, medium cost of production group, and the high production group here, cost of production group. And you can see there's slightly more cows. The herd size is a little bit bigger on the low cost of production group. So those are the farms that probably have the higher net income, more likely to be profitable. The farmers who participate get a report back on their own farm every single year, so they can look at their own cost of production for all of these different items and compare it to the benchmark. And when we give them the benchmark, they can compare themselves to the average farms and also the farms in those three different categories of cost of production. And I do have all those numbers up here for those of you who are spreadsheet nerds like us. So farms that were selling more milk per cow had a lower cost of production. So this has been one of the very consistent, statistically significant things that we've seen for each of the years that we've done this. So you can see the average milk per cow, 8,410 pounds sold per cow, but the low cost of production group, they were selling almost 9,800 pounds of milk per cow per lactation. And that high cost of production group were under 7,000 pounds of milk sold per cow. Here's the numbers for you. So in 2024, farms were feeding an average of 1.86 gallons for 5¼ months. And within that, again, there were some farms feeding it for a little bit less time, but most of the farms were feeding it for well over 5 months. And so it was 2,518 pounds of milk. So when we added that back into that 8,400 that they were selling on average, the milk produced per cow was pretty similar to the national average of 9,200 pounds that was actually produced before milk was diverted. So within that, there's a really big difference in that some farms are keeping a lot of calves and some farms are just keeping enough calves for their replacement heifers. That has changed over the last year or two because the price farmers are getting paid for certified grass-fed, especially if they're also certified A2, which a lot of these grass-fed milk buyers require now, certified organic cows, like they're getting $2,500 to $6,000 for a bred heifer or a cow. And so farmers are starting to divert more milk to calves again, raise more calves, so they might be shipping more milk, but then they're getting more income from calf and replacement sales. So when we do the 2025, I'm partly into collecting the 2025 data. We're looking at maybe running the numbers a couple of different ways for the farmers so that they can kind of hone in on the pros and cons of the opportunity cost of continuing to raise lots of calves, even if the market is paying really well for those animals. Did I answer your question? So looking at some of the other things that correlate with the lower cost of production farms that have a higher net income, another one is labor efficiency. So in the combined data from 2023 and 2024, we saw that the farms managing more cows per full-time worker had a lower cost of production. And for every cow that they added per FTE, it lowered their cost of production by 0.56, so 56 cents a hundredweight in lower cost of production. And in this, an FTE included both paid and unpaid family labor, and it was assigned at like 3,000 hours a year was a full-time equivalent. So let's see. Yeah, then also just looking at milk per full-time worker was higher on the farms that had the lower cost of production. And also these low cost of production farms were also generating more additional income, non-milk income. And that might have been from crop sales, from selling some extra forages, or it might have been from selling some of these increasingly high-priced cows, calves, and heifers. So there's the breakout where you can see that there's more milk sold per FTE, as well as more cows per FTE on those low cost of production farms. So the two big things in the cost of production is farms selling more milk per cow and selling more milk per FTE had a lower cost of production, higher net income. So, and then we can also think about the fact that I also talked about the cows, they're reporting that they're making less milk during the grazing season if they have a higher pasture intake, which is kind of interesting, right? So there's a whole array of things that people can do so that they can sell more milk per cow. And we're just talking about a few of them in here. So it could be reducing crowding, reducing competition for feed. So half the year these farmers, the cows are in some sort of a housing system and being fed forages. Stress reduction, laying time. Someone asked yesterday, well, how much of that reduction in the amount of milk that the cows are making during the grazing season is due to heat stress? That could certainly be a piece of it. Walking distance, calories being burned as they're walking out to the pastures. Some of the other things on the list that are not directly grazing related, improving reproduction, making sure. One of the things that happens on these farms once they go grass fed is they can run into an energy deficit. So the cows, especially for a new farm that's just converted to grass fed, the grain's been eliminated. Maybe they don't have the genetics quite tuned in yet. Maybe they don't have the energy in the forages yet. Cows might not be breeding back on that 12 or 13 month calving interval as well. So you might start having days in milk creep out. That can be part of what can lower milk production. Genetics, selection, size your heifers are when they calve in. Generally, the first calf heifers are the ones that struggle the most in these systems, and they tend to produce less milk and have a harder time breeding back. And then raising fewer calves, but only if that's the best math for your farm, and access to good water, minerals, and then forage fiber digestibility, I think, is really huge in this. Forage quality. So one of the things we saw in the cost of production data set in both 2023 and 2024 is farmers who ranked their forages, whether they bought them or made them, if they ranked their forages as excellent, they produced 1,432 more pounds of milk per cow. And so, this is, I think, extra important for the all grass farm because they don't have that little, even just a little bit of grain can make a huge difference. Like 3 to 5 pounds of grain as an energy supplement, if you have moderate to not so good forage, can make a huge difference. Whereas these guys have to do it entirely with the energy from the forages. So Kurt Kotanch, who's an independent nutritionist, teamed up with us, and one of the resource materials that we have on the website is just a detailed fact sheet on how to read a forage test, how to take a good forage test, and how to really understand what are the energy sources in these forages that allow the 100% grass-fed farm to meet all of their energy needs on with just the forages. I won't go through that because that could take like 20 minutes, and it's really fun. So this one's really interesting. So remember I said milk production is reported to be lower on farms with higher pasture intake during the grazing season, but in this same group of farms, we found that in the 2023 and the 2024 data, farms that had a longer grazing season had a lower cost of production, and their cost of production went down by 18 cents a hundredweight for each day that their grazing season got longer. And this is a trend that I've seen as a business planning consultant, is the higher intake in the summer. Some farms that pays off, some farms it doesn't, but the longer grazing season and eliminating those like full winter, going to the barn costs, the bedding, the feed, everything, can often, that really is the cost savings for the farm. So then thinking about what factors allow for extending the grazing season, obviously fertile, healthy soils, maybe growing some annuals, overwintering some triticale for spring grazing, maybe growing some midsummer warm season annuals, carefully managing a diverse pasture plant species following the good grazing guidelines, doing some math and making sure the farm isn't overstocked or understocked and adjusting that as needed, And then grazing planning. Did Troy escape already? He's been running around wearing a shirt that is actually a grazing chart, which I think is awesome because then you really have your grazing chart with you all the time to do your. Yeah, yes, if you print it upside down, it would be even better. So purchase fertility input and seed. Farms that were spending more per acre on buying in seed and fertilizer of various types produced more milk per cow. So obviously, like improved forage varieties, improved the forage quality, better digestibility, more milk. So I want to talk a little bit about just some of the, when I do these cost of production visits, we're collecting data, but it's also a technical assistance visit. So like once we get through the cost of production, data entry, I've got a little portable printer because at least 60% of the farmers are Amish, so there's no electricity, there's no printer. So I carry a battery pack, a computer, and a printer. So I can print it out and give them the piece of paper, and then we sit down and we start looking at it. And they want to know, well, how come my cost of production is a little bit higher than the benchmark or than the low cost benchmark? And for some of the farms, it's related to forage yield. For some of them, it's related to forage quality and the fact that milk production isn't quite as high as they would like it to be. So I just want to go through kind of some of the things that we talk about. And these certainly also apply to farms feeding grain, but they're just extra critically important to these all grass farms. So the first thing is just assessing how much legume is out in the pastures. And it's always amazes me how few people realize that red clover doesn't stay in your pasture forever. You either have to let it go to seed and establish a seed bank, or you're going to need to be frost seeding it all the time. So these are a bunch of slides from Sarah Ziegler and Heather Darby at the UVM Northwest Crops and Soils program in Vermont. And so this one is showing that if you can get the legumes around 30%, that's when you can really start to see the higher yields. And so these are 4 different grass species: brome, meadow fescue, orchard grass, and timothy. The green bars are grass only, and the orange bars are with that added clover in the seed mix. And so you can see on a dry matter yield of tons per acre, they're significantly higher, going from, the biggest difference was the meadow fescue was under 2.5 tons of dry matter and hit, looks like 4 tons to the acre with the added legume. And so the significant increases with all of those. Doing just the basic agronomic test. I see people getting really excited about all of these new soil health tests, but they don't necessarily give me the information that I need as an agronomist to be able to know what the right thing is for the farm to add to the soil or do to the soil or plant. So I like just a basic agronomic test. Make sure it has the trace minerals in it. The first thing I start working on is just getting the pH into the right spot by adding wood ash or lime, so that then you can get the legumes established and get them to persist. And then soil compaction is increasingly a challenge for a lot of the farms and is sometimes a limiting factor, even more so than the pH or other things. My slides are sliding off the slides apparently. In addition to the agronomic tests, I also like to do regular shovel tests where you're just like digging up a chunk of soil, looking at it. That is going to give you more information about potential soil compaction and soil health than any of the other tests, and is particularly important if you do suspect that soil compaction is part of the limiting factor. It's also really important to make sure that farms are buying in the right varieties and the right species. And increasingly, I think it's a bad idea to buy any of the generic seed mixes if you don't know what the specific variety is in there. So it might say meadow fescue, perennial ryegrass, and tall fescue, and red clover. But there's a huge difference in palatability, particularly in pastures, of particularly the tall fescue. Some of it they'll eat, some of it they really will not eat. I'm actually seeing some similar trends with the meadow fescue. So palatability, also persistence, yield, and then the quality and digestibility. And so I'm about to show you a few more slides from the Northwest Crops and Soils crew. They have a research farm in Alburgh, Vermont, where they do variety trials every year on all sorts of stuff, including these cool season grasses and legumes, so that you can hone in and try to figure out like what are the varieties I should be planting, what are the species I should be planting. Obviously, you're going to have to adjust this to wherever you are geographically. So this one is showing both digestibility and also the yield. So the line on the top is showing NDFD. So that's showing you the fiber digestibility in these forages. And a lot of the energy that your all grass cow is going to get comes from fiber digestibility. And so you want to make sure, that's why early first cut is really the best quality winter feed that most of these farms are using, because that has nice fiber digestibility, as long as it's not a late first cut. But you can see there's huge differences between these varieties in both the yield showed in the bar chart, where you can see the first, second, and third cut, and in some case some fourth cut. And then you can also see the fiber digestibility is much better in some of the varieties than others. So you can see perennial ryegrass is one of the stars. So is the Festilolium. I know you can't read this. This is like my favorite one to look at because it looks at the yield of all of these individual varieties. So that last one was just how they organized the information for some specific varieties that they were looking at. This one is for the individual species. This one's looking at the very different varieties, and you can get this information on their website. I have one copy of it on my table in the corner also. So it's showing you the yield of the Kentucky bluegrass, 2 specific varieties, the perennial ryegrass, the timothy, the meadow fescue. So you can really see there's huge differences. And if you're just buying a generic mix on the farm, you really don't know which one of these varieties you're getting. It's probably just whatever they have extra of. And so I always recommend that farmers, unless it's a tiny little area and it's a mix that they are pretty sure is going to be palatable, it's usually worth putting together a custom blend of seeds, or get together with a bunch of farms and do it. And I apologize, something strange happened to my slides when they got moved onto a different computer. But I also just wanted to talk about some of the other things that might be contributing to like the lower milk production during the grazing season, which is the elongation of the stems on the grasses. So thinking about how much more difficult it can be when the pastures have all headed out to be able to maintain enough dry matter intake and enough digestible fiber to maintain good milk production. It's easier to do if you're feeding 3 to 5 pounds of grain to get that highly digestible nutrients in there. But as you move from the really digestible forage into that headed out stuff, that might be part of why we see a drop in milk production on some of these farms, or a lot of these farms, in the middle of the grazing season. So one of the other reasons I think it's really important to look at the individual varieties that you're planting gets back to that previous slide, which is, in addition to how we do the grazing, we also can control the heading dates of these grasses by selecting varieties that tend to head out later. And so if you're thinking like, oh yeah, all of the Kentucky bluegrass heads out in May and all of the orchard grass heads out, 1 week later, that's not necessarily true. The variety heading dates really change a lot. And so this is just showing the heading time generally of the different ones. So you can see like within the, here's orchard grass, for example. It's got very early heading dates to really late heading dates. And so if all the farm does is switch over from an early heading orchard grass to a late heading orchard grass, that could make a huge difference in terms of the digestibility Because as we all know, it often rains when you're trying to get first cut. And if you're able to get that first cut in before it heads out, and that's actually one of the questions we ask in the data collection is we ask what percentage of first cut were you able to get before it headed out to try to correlate that with what their milk production is. Calvin.
Those later heading grass varieties, are they correlating with, like, are those varieties also higher NDF or lower NDF varieties?
I think that would be determined more by the timing of harvest. I don't know if Sarah's got something to add to that.
You might have several harvests that you see the small, so that they're not comparing one that's fully fit out, one that's still there.
Yep. Yeah.
So for, let's say you're looking at this, and like, yeah, I want later heading orchard grass, but you're looking at your field where you have a whole bunch of early heading orchard grass and a variety of others. What's your recommendation for someone?
Yeah, so I am totally in favor of tillage and reseeding in certain situations. And for an all grass dairy or a dairy that doesn't want to feed much grain, if what they have growing out there really is not working for them, it may be worth looking at rotating through into improved forage varieties. It's very farm dependent. Some of the, I mean, as you know, some of the soils, it's really tilling them up is not going to be feasible or a good idea. There's going to be too many rocks or too much erosion. But I do think that there are times where creating some sort of significant disruption and doing a reseeding so that you can quickly move a farm to having that dairy quality feed is really important. Yeah. I always try every other thing before I go to tillage. So I might try, addressing the soil fertility. I'll try frost seeding or overseeding. If it's an area where a no-till drill could improve things, I'll try that first. But particularly if it is, high density forage that isn't the right quality and isn't palatable, that's when I'll look at some sort of surface disruption and switching over to a different one. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
On that same vein, I don't know if this is a question amongst the farms that are part of it, but are any of the farms looking ahead of time, like to avoid that coming out mid-summer and getting back to it? And we do that on my farm, but I know it's fall, so I don't know how feasible that is.
Yes, so the question is about pre-clipping. So it's interesting, actually. There were a number of farms early in the project who were pre-clipping on their dairy, for their dairy herds, where they would go out the morning of, clip the pasture that was a little gone by, a little over mature and too stemmy. They would let it wilt a bit and then they would graze it. Most of them have stopped doing that because they found that milk production wasn't great. And I assume that's because the cows were eating more non-digestible fiber in that stemmy stuff because it was mowed off, a little wilted, easy to eat, but that might have been slowing the rate of passage, limiting intake of more digestible things. So I see much less pre-clipping. There are quite a few farmers who do post-clipping. So when things get ahead of them, they'll graze through it, they give them a bigger area, they don't push them too hard, and then they'll clip afterwards so that then the next regrowth is easier for the cows to get in and graze. Yep. And I'm usually, like when I'm just teaching a grazing workshop, I often try to discourage people from too much post-grazing clipping. But when it comes to an all-grass dairy, that's where I think, yeah, this is a tool we might really need to use more of. As long as you're not clipping too short, because just like grazing too short, that kills a lot of those improved varieties. So actually now I'm going to show a couple of slides from a farm that does feed some grain. And just as we kind of reflect on this big picture question of having this larger amount of pasture in the diet during the grazing season seems to be on the grass-fed farms associated with lower milk production. But is that lower milk production not a big deal because it's correlated with lower feed costs? Yeah, It's another topic. I talked a little bit about that yesterday, and Roy probably talked about it too. It's a fun topic, but yeah. So these are the feed costs. Can I name you guys? At Celine and Jordy's farm, where they started tracking their feed costs per hundredweight during the year so that they could see what their feed costs were during the grazing season and during the winter feeding season. And you can see this like really abrupt drop in feed cost when they go out to pasture in the summer. So this is not an all grass farm, but it's just an example as we kind of think through, like, yeah, the cows are making less milk in the summer, but maybe that's not a big deal for a lot of these farms because their feed costs are so much lower.
We do have a spring and fall section in that. We value pasture at 0 cents a pound, but we realize it's not true, but we want to kind of pass cost and then figure out what pasture costs.
Great. I love it, you guys. And then this is the one that Celine just sent me for 2025. And actually, if anybody has, is there a really good US like pasture record system? I know Jim Garish used to keep one that tracks like the pasture growth curve for the US. We couldn't find one, so she was using the one from, I think, from Ireland. But this is income minus feed costs in 2025, and you can just kind of see that the income minus feed costs very precisely follows like the pasture growth curve that we would typically see. So lower milk production might not be a terrible economic impact, and sometimes pushing for higher milk production isn't necessarily going to improve the farm net income, but it might. So let's see, how are we doing for time? Okay. Yeah, I've got about 10 more slides. I want to have plenty of time for discussion about this fun stuff. So I also just want to talk a little bit about the amount of effort that it takes a cow to eat all of her dry matter intake needs from just forage or just pasture. So this is a farm in New York State where in the morning before we did the workshop, the farmer went out with his horse and his mower, and he mowed and then raked up and brought in the pile of pasture to represent on an as-fed basis how much the cow would have to eat every day to meet her needs. And these were small cows, not making a lot of milk. So it was only about 200 pounds on an as-fed basis. It's not 133 pounds. I think it was it two? Yeah, it was 200 pounds, not 133 pounds. Oh, that's right. For 30 pounds, it was 200 pounds she had to eat. For 20 pounds, it was 133 pounds that she had to eat. So that's the 200-pound pile, and we set a good-sized square bale near it for perspective. So it's a pretty significant athletic feat, and cows can only take about 25,000 bites a day. And so you really need to be thinking about that efficiency of like, how many bites does she need to take to get a mouthful? Hopefully only one. And how quickly and efficiently can she fill her rumen? And so some of the things we can do to help them is to increase the density of the pasture sward. And one of the best ways to do that is to increase the diversity. So you can see the photo on your right is just grasses, and they're very vertical, and they tend to have lower density if it's just grasses. If you add in the clovers, where the leaves are growing like this, and the forbs where the leaves are growing like this, then you tend to have higher density. The other thing that you get more density from is having more grass tillers per square foot. So these are things we can be monitoring on our pastures, is the diversity, but also getting a sense of how many tillers per square foot are we managing to maintain in our pastures over time with management. And if you see that tiller density going down, you know you need to do something to change that. If it starts going up, you know you're starting to do the right thing. And then this is Dr. Dana Lossiter's cow time budget for the day, looking at all of the things the cow has to do every day. So she's got to be lying there for about half the day, chewing her cud. And when she's laying down with pressure on her udder, chewing her cud. That's a lot of that is when she's making more milk. So you can increase milk production by making sure the cows are laying down with the pressure on their udder, resting. They need time drinking. They need to be socializing. They also need time to chew their cud. And so they can't be eating the entire day. And so their eating time needs to be very efficient. And particularly if you factor in then walking to the pasture, walking to water, and walking in to be milked. This is some data that Sarah Ziegler put together with a separate group of farms that were 100% grass-fed, where they were collecting DHIA or Dairy One data to look at milk production and MUNS, which is milk urea nitrogen, just to get a sense of like how balanced is the protein to energy in these grass-fed cows during the grazing season. So milk production is the blue line and the MUNs are the red line. And so this shows really clearly that milk production went up in the spring as they went out to pasture, but then it really started to drop down. And at the same time that milk production dropped, you can see the milk urea nitrogen coming up. So it's indicating that energy with this group of farms might have been the lacking factor, or too much soluble protein might have been contributing to the lower milk production at that time of the year. And that might be really different for a farm feeding grain, but for this group that were grass-fed, this was the data that we had. So then this was looking at the amount of NDF, neutral detergent fiber, which was actually surprisingly steady over the grazing season. Protein was going up in the orange line in here, but then the water-soluble carbohydrates, which is another energy source other than the digestible fiber, really dropping down during the grazing season. So this might be another reason that we see that the grass-fed farms really might be struggling to get enough energy to support that higher milk production. So I've just got a few slides here, just reflecting back on what are the things that farmers who are 100% grass-fed need to be doing to monitor their cows. Yes, Eileen, you got a question? I don't know. I don't know if there might have been a few spreading compost or manure. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so like if you were, fertigating, for example, if you were taking some manure out of the manure pit during the grazing season and spreading it, or spreading some compost during the grazing season, it's a good question. Or what if you changed the forage varieties to, some of the improved higher energy grasses? That would be another question I'd be curious about. Yeah. Yeah, really good point, Tom. Yeah, so summer annuals and that timing would match up really nicely with that. And that is a strategy that some of the farms do. So by summer annuals, that would be something like a warm season grass that's grown as an annual. It would be like millet or sorghum sudan grass would be the typical ones. So those might be grazed in the midsummer in that slump. So you've got the less grass productivity. It looks like lower energy. So you could have, you could strip graze the cows for a half an hour or an hour through some warm season annuals right before milking in the afternoon. Yeah, question in the back. Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed. I missed the woody forages. Oh yeah, yep, yeah, yep. Yeah, none of them were doing woody forages. The forbs that some of the farms are using are mostly chicory and plantain and dandelions. Yeah.
Some are halfway between concentrate for it. Surprising. It's not as good as food that chemical low by a higher.
So I'm just gonna, I don't know if I'll necessarily go through all of these unless folks want to, because I feel like it's more fun to have some general discussion, but this is just like the list of things that are helpful to be thinking about when you're monitoring how the cows are doing. You want to monitor, you know, tiller density in the pasture, but you also want to be monitoring the well-being of the cows. Mineral deficiencies is something that can happen on these farms because they're no longer force feeding the minerals in the grain. And so it's usually the farms, more and more of them are working either with a veterinarian or a nutritionist to have a grain formulated based on their forage tests and also fed in a loose mineral mix, not in a mineral lick, so that you know that they can get enough of it from actually getting a mouthful of it, and also monitoring how much of it that they're getting. And we see generally selenium and phosphorus have been the two deficiencies we see most frequently on the all grass farms.
And that's another one of the species substitutes that we'll get to that on the.
It's true. Yep. Yep. The woody shrubs definitely have more of it. So yeah, just the summary slide, and then we can just talk about all of this stuff and answer questions. Overall, for the all grass farms, the farms selling more milk per cow had a lower cost of production in both 2023 and 2024. And that's been consistent for, I think, every single year in that we've been doing the grass-fed benchmark. Farms that had better labor efficiency, that were managing more cows per FTE, had a total lower cost of production by 58 cents, a hundredweight reduction in cost for each additional cow. Farms with a longer grazing season had a lower cost of production, with each day lowering the cost of production by 18 cents a hundredweight on average. Farmers who ranked their forages, their stored forages, as excellent, on average made 1,432 more pounds of milk per cow, per lactation. And farmers spending more money on seed and fertilizer produced more milk per cow. So that's just like my summary of what I thought some of the more interesting, statistically significant things were. And I will say, I know a bunch of you asked me all sorts of good questions yesterday. We collected a lot of data, and if we didn't put it in the report, it's because we didn't find something to be statistically significant. But you're welcome to ask me lots more questions. But every now and then I might just have to say, Sarah Ziegler, did we run that stat? And the answer is probably yes. And if it's not up there, it's probably because it wasn't statistically significant. So yeah, I think we've got maybe 5 or 6 minutes for questions and discussion. And I'll just remind folks that like there's vast amounts of information on the Northwest Crops and Soils UVM website. There's a whole grass-fed section there. You're also welcome to come up afterwards if you want some copies of things. I do have some copies here. And also all of those forage variety trials that I was talking about, those are also found on the Northwest Crops and Soils website. So